Welcome back to Liquid Lunch. We're here with Bruce Bell, historian. 13 years. You've been a historian.
Writing for the
Or
Bulletin, yes.
writing for the Bulletin.
Yes, I was a historian the day I was born, I think. I think
Okay.
it's genetic with people.
Well,
I
it
mean,
might be
you're born
genetic,
with.
and this is Jeanette.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think history is really cool.
Well,
And
I think anything, you obviously listen to the passion you have. That's a genetic thing. It's
I
something you're
know.
born with.
it's also a cultural thing. I'm very,
No,
very
and you're very passionate about it.
Well,
That's,
okay. What's interesting? Okay, so we're just coming on, right? And we just discovered just before we came on, Jeanette is from Belleville, of course.
yeah.
I am from Welland, and you're from Sudbury.
Sudbury, yes.
So here we are. We all came
Yeah.
to Toronto, and here we are.
500 people a day move to this city.
Wow. No wonder they're building so many condos.
You know,
500 people a day.
a day move to Toronto.
What's the appeal?
Why did you move here, Jeanette?
I'll tell you why I moved here because I was forced to move here. That's why. No,
I was
serious-
forced too.
Forced. I was like, "You're 18. Get out of here because I don't want you in a small town. You'll never meet a Jewish guy." That's why I left Belleville.
Reasonable.
Did you come here for
Practical.
the same reason?
Sure. I mean, not to find a Jewish guy, but I love Sudbury. I have a passion for Sudbury. I really love my hometown, and I try and go back as much as I can. And I write sometimes for their local paper when I can. 200 people lived here in the year 1800.
Only
200
200
people.
in
So when you
1800.
think, and then by 1900, we had 500,000 people. So in
Wow.
that mere 100 years, how fast this city grew.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, by 1950, we hit the million people mark. And now we're, the GTA 5 million. They say in 25 years, we'll be up, 10 million people. And if the world doesn't end on Saturday, I think the Golden Horseshoe, Niagara Falls, Toronto, Hamilton, is all going to just join together.
Yeah.
Really?
in
Wow.
one
Well,
big
it's-
mega
So
city.
you
Kinda
think
is
we'll be
already,
bigger than New York
almost.
then?
Yeah, I mean already. I mean you think of New York, especially Manhattan. Toronto is far larger than Manhattan. I mean Manhattan's this shoved-in little island with enormous buildings on it, where in Toronto is growing at a remarkable rate. And when you look at the history of our city from the year 1800, when there were 10 streets downtown and 200 people, sometimes maybe 4 people living in one street, by 1820, 2,000 people. Nothing much happened until the coming of the railroad, and that's what changed the course of our history, was the railway. There was a choice between the railway choosing Hamilton over Toronto.
Yeah, I guess at one time there was a real serious rivalry between Hamilton and Toronto
Oh, sure.
to be the center of the
Yes.
Ontario
Oh,
universe.
And they almost won. I mean, Hamilton was, really willing to give the railroad the. You could be right on the water. Where here there was an argument. There was a beautiful park along the harbor front at one time in the city before the railway came, when Front Street fronted the lake. Everything south of Front Street is the landfill. The garbage of the city was just dumped there, creating the harbor. So the railway said,
really?
and it's every time they dig up, when they put a new condo on the lakefront, they dig up this garbage. They dig up not just banana peels and Coke bottles, but they dig up the remains of horses. I mean, all the horses when the horse town was
Really?
run by horses, all thrown into the water. Trains are in there, boats. I mean, there's tons of garbage. Oh, and that's how they recycled back then. They just threw
Yeah.
it into the water.
The good old days.
Wow. No
And
wonder
plus
Lake
the
Ontario
building
is
of
so
the
polluted.
subway, all that's in the water too. All that earth.
And they're still putting it out on the Leslie Street.
Yeah,
spit,
and they
right?
call it clean fill, and
Yeah.
I'm sure it is. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're a little more careful, but there was no regulation until 1969 of what you could put in the Great Lakes. You could just open sewer was just poured into the Great Lakes.
So, are you? One thing I was just you said, and I wanted to ask you: are you saying that originally what is now Front Street was
Yes.
the tip of Lake?
Well, that's why they
Ontario?
call it Front Street, because it fronted the lake.
Wow. So would that be like where the number 2 highway continued? All
Number
the-
2 highway.
Yeah, like Lake Shore.
That was Kingston Road, I guess, was number 2 highway, right?
Well, Kingston Road, King Street. I mean, that at one time was the heart. Bloor Street used to be Lake Ontario at one time, and St. Clair was Lake Ontario. The
Really?
lake has receded naturally. Also, I mean, the Niagara Escarpment is the old shoreline, which St. Clair Avenue is. But that was 10,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, it was Bloor Street, and by the time the British arrived here in 1793, Front Street was the lake, Ontario.
How did Toronto become the city that it is? Originally, it was Fort York.
Originally, it was, of course, First Nations. Toronto meant in Huron, it means meeting place, and in Mohawk, and forgive our Mohawk listeners, Toronto, I think it's pronounced with a K, means sticks in the water. There are actually two meanings to it. Sticks in the water, meeting place. But when Britain arrived here in 1793, they changed all the Indian-sounding names to very British names. So the old village of Toronto, which really had no one was really living here. A lot of the First Nations were coming down from further north to fish in April and May, but they didn't build anything here. And the French were here for 100 years. They built a fort called Fort Rouillé on the grounds of the CNE.
It's still there, or a remnant
the
of it.
burnt out remains are. They were there for 100 years. This was all Louis XIV's land.
Really?
Versailles. Have you ever been to
Wow.
Versailles?
Oh, yes, I have. And it is
Beautiful.
gorgeous.
And that was all. This was all his land. He was very aware of this place. He
So
knew.
what is now Fort Henry was originally a French fort.
Fort Henry?
Oh no, that's in Kingston.
Kingston. Fort York. No.
Was originally
That was
no?
always a British fort. The
Okay.
French fort was on the grounds of the CNE.
It's still
close,
there. You
close
can go
by,
there.
Yeah.
There's a plaque. There's a little building
There's a monument there, yes.
of the original French fort.
But very small. No more than
Yeah.
maybe 20 people were ever there at a time. And it was voyageurs, coming down from French River, down the Toronto Passage with fur trading.
Wow.
So it wasn't until 1793 that Britain finally established a real town where St. Lawrence Market is today. That's where Toronto was founded.
And I
That
guess
was
they
the
were
original part of Toronto.
Is right there, St. Lawrence Market,
the old town.
Old Town.
And I guess that was done in conjunction, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, but that's a little right after the American Revolution,
Yes, I mean,
right after Wolfe's
very-
conquest of Quebec, and it
Very,
was
Wolfe's conquest first. They died, of course, 1759. And that's really when Quebec became British, and sadly, as they would say. Celine Dion never says she's a Canadian. She's always a Quebecois. And Niagara-on-the-Lake becomes the capital of Ontario, or Upper Canada, where we are.
Niagara-on-the-Lake
Niagara-on-the-Lake,
was?
and it was known as Newark back then. And the American Revolution happens in 1776, which is as many stairs in the CN Tower, 1776. And that is when 35% of our population is now American, because thousands and thousands, over 100,000 Americans who did not want to live under a president, they wanted to be loyal to the king, and they were the United Empire Loyalists. They're the ones that came up here.
Interestingly enough, I mentioned I come from Belleville, and it's a real Empire Loyalist
Oh,
town.
yes,
And
very
I
much
think it
so.
was started in 1763, around there
Yes,
too.
yes.
And I know a little bit about it, in that it was rivaling Ottawa to be at one time considered the capital of
Kingston
Ontario.
or Belleville?
Belleville.
That I did not know.
Yeah, it was. But I'm curious about Toronto. I know, where the distillery is right
Yes,
now? Was
yes,
that the
yes,
original port
yes.
of Toronto?
No, that was the end of the old harbor. That was at
Oh.
that was the last factory at the very end. And ironically, it's the only one that's survived. There were over 100 factories along Front Street.
So
at
the
one time.
cobblestones and all that they have there that they use for the movie shoots, are they authentic, or were
80% of those stones are original, and they are mostly from Ohio. When
Ohio,
the coal
wow.
ships were coming over in the 19th century that's where we got most of our coal from, to blast our furnaces, they would put a layer of bricks in the bottom of ships to ballast, to keep them afloat so the coal wouldn't shift during the storm. So when they'd unload the coal, they'd unload all those bricks and they would pave our streets with them. And if you go to the distillery, you will see every so often you will see a stone that has that stamped in it, the Canton, Ohio Brickworks.
Wow.
And you will see that.
Was Toronto built to be more American or more British, like a London type of town?
Originally, yes, very colonial wooden town, not much to write home about. It wasn't until, again, the coming of the railroad, 1850, that the population and the building boom happened, and we started to look like London. All of our buildings and banks took on this very beautiful London look as of St. Lawrence Hall has today. If you go there on King Street, that's a very British-looking building. But by 1900, a lot of those buildings were gone, replaced with very French-style buildings. Paris, as we know today, most of the France was built all in the 1870s, in a 10-year period. Baron Haussmann, the great French planner of Paris, was told by Napoleon III, tear down medieval Paris, all gone. 70% of Paris was wiped off the map, and the Paris we know was rebuilt in the 1870s. So this caused a revolution in architecture around the world. Everyone wanted to look like the Second Empire style, as they call it. Well, Toronto embraced that look. And they were sending architects over to Paris, coming back with drawings and plans. And so by 1900, the New York Times had dubbed Toronto the Paris on the Lake. Some of the most beautiful French Second Empire style buildings. Unfortunately, they're all gone.
All of them?
There's maybe a handful. There's
Wow.
one, if you go to the Irish Embassy pub on the corner of Yonge and Wellington, is one of the last remaining real Second Empire style buildings, and it's the last of a whole block of, if you look at it from across the street, you'll see that beautiful French look. Henry Langley was our great architect of the 19th century who built many of this beautiful French style. Also, the CNE, the remaining buildings out there, all done in that very French exposition style that was all the rage at the turn of the century. But Toronto, after the Second World War, tore down 25,000 buildings in the downtown core. I mean, 500 buildings were torn down to build the TD Centre, 700 buildings to build the Eaton Centre, and we lost it all. It's all gone.
Not to mention, I've seen some of those photos of, for example, the armory that was right here where the
Yes,
City
the big
Hall.
big
and
castle.
it looked like a beautiful building.
Beautiful building. And people would say, why did we allow that to happen? Well, Frederick Gardner, who they named the Gardner Expressway after, he was our Metro chairman. He was called Big Daddy Big Daddy Freddie, and he was the guy in control of this. And he, him and his cronies just said, get rid of every old building in the city. I want a much more modern city, the one we have today. And a lot of the people who were coming into our city were, immigrants, and they did not want to complain. They were quite happy to be here. And yes, there was a bit of there was no real public outcry that he was demolishing the downtown core. And some people said, just that you really shouldn't do that. You should maybe save something. And he was ready to knock down, of course, Old City Hall. They were going to, and Osgood Hall was going to be slated for
Those
demolition.
are beautiful buildings.
And after the Second World War, every building in the city was covered in coal dust and grime. You couldn't see the true beauty behind them. You had to clean them first. So luckily, the ones that were cleaned, the rest of us got to see just how beautiful the city is underneath all that coal dust.
And yet, it's funny because Toronto has often been criticized as an ugly corporate town, whereas Montreal gets, the Euro-style beauty. And here you're pointing out that, in fact, we had French-style beauty too, and then it seems
French,
like they
Italian.
took it away.
We had some of the most beautiful buildings that, could rival anything in Rome, London, Paris, Munich, Germany. We had a Masonic Hall on Toronto Street at one time, was built to kind of look like the City Hall of Munich. I mean, there was, when you look at
I wonder
what we've
why would
gone-
they do that? Take away all that art, history, culture,
What they
and
should have
European
done
flair.
is built a newer town a bit westward. They should have left the old town, the 19th century town, intact and built a new financial core where the Sky Dome is, like that whole area, which was all just land that was, not much was on there, railroad and a lot of old sheds. They really should have built a bigger, which Montreal did. They saved old Montreal and built Montreal, but also lost a lot of buildings too. I mean, during their Expo 67, when they were building the freeways going right through Montreal, they lost as much as we did, as did New York City. New York lost a phenomenal amount of buildings. I mean, we're not the only one. It's just very obvious with ours because our downtown core is very beautiful.